My name is Amina, and I have spent 3 years perfecting the art of disappearing. Not literally. I am still here, still breathing, still carrying heavy silver trays through the polished corridors of Jonha, Seoul's most secretive private restaurant. But I have learned how to move through a room without leaving a single impression. Eyes down, voice soft, smile small and forgettable. It is a skill I practiced every single day until it became my entire identity. Jonha is not a normal restaurant. Normal restaurants have menus on tables and music playing through small speakers. Jonha has neither. The walls are draped in dark silk, the lighting is permanently dim, and the guests speak in murmurs that die before they reach the corridor. Politicians come here, billionaires come here. Men whose names appear in no public records come here and eat expensive food and make decisions that reshape entire neighborhoods by morning. I come here because it is the easiest place in Seoul to be invisible. I grew up far from this city, in a world my co-workers would never understand or believe. A tiny Korean African missionary settlement tucked into a green valley in Ghana, built by my Korean grandfather and my grandmother, who came from the mountains of Gangwon province decades before I was born. I carry both worlds inside me, but I show neither. Tonight, something felt different the moment I arrived for my shift. The manager, Mr. Bake, was sweating through his collar. The kitchen was quieter than usual, which was always more frightening than noise. Ji-hoon Kang is coming tonight, Mr. Bake whispered to no one in particular, and he is not coming alone. The entire kitchen went still. I had seen Ji-hoon Kang before. He came to Jonha 4 or 5 times a year, always alone, always in a charcoal suit that fit like it was sewn directly onto his body. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. When he walked through the front entrance, the room reorganized itself around him the way water moves around a stone. He was the heir to the Kang organization, which controlled more of Seoul's shadow economy than any government agency publicly admitted. Shipping routes, private debt collection, certain neighborhoods where the police learned long ago not to ask questions. Everyone who worked at Jeonha understood that Ji-hoon Kang was not a man you inconvenienced. But tonight, when the black vehicles arrived and the heavy front doors opened, even Ji-hoon Kang stood differently. He walked half a step behind the old man. Kang Dae-sung moved slowly, leaning on a dark wooden cane topped with a brass tiger head, worn smooth from decades of handling. He was smaller than his son, thinner, with deep lines carved into his face like old wood grain. But the room responded to him the way it never responded to Ji-hoon. The wealthy guests stopped mid-sentence. The waitstaff pressed themselves against walls. His eyes swept the room once, slowly, and found something wrong in everything they touched. I gripped my tray tighter and pressed into the shadow beside the service station. His gaze moved across the room like a slow searchlight. For one terrible second, it passed over me and paused. Then it moved on. I let out the breath I had been holding and told myself I had imagined it. Mr. Back grabbed my arm before I could retreat to the kitchen. "You, private room, water service." His whisper was shaking. "Stay against the wall. Do not speak. Do not make eye contact. Do not exist." I wanted to tell him that not existing was the one thing I was genuinely good at. Instead, I nodded and picked up the silver water pitcher. The private room at the back of Jeonha was reserved for moments exactly like this one. Round table, high-backed chairs, a single hanging light above the center. Ji-hoon sat across from his father with the stiff posture of a man bracing against strong wind. Dae-sung barely touched his food. He sat with both hands resting on his cane, watching his son the way a teacher watches a student he has already decided to fail. Then he began to speak. The language hit me like cold water thrown across my face. It was not standard Korean. It was not even the rough regional dialect I sometimes heard from older delivery men in my neighborhood. This was something far older, something that lived in the back of the throat and carried the weight of mountain soil and wood smoke in every syllable. A dialect spoken in isolated highland villages generations ago, preserved only in the mouths of old families who had never fully come down from the mountains. My grandmother's voice. My heart slammed against my ribs. I kept my face completely empty and continued pouring water, but every word Dae-sung spoke landed in me like a stone dropping into still water. He was telling his son that he had become soft, that his empire smelled of foreign money and borrowed confidence, that he had forgotten the language of his own blood. Jihoon's jaw was tight. He understood enough to know he was being cut down, but not enough to cut back. I kept pouring. I kept breathing. I told myself it was not my business. Daesung's voice rose sharply in the old dialect. He said Jihoon's leadership was a hollow drum, loud on the outside and empty inside. He said men who could not speak the language of their ancestors could not truly protect them. Then he grabbed the wine glass. He did not throw it. He slammed it straight down onto the edge of the silver serving tray on the table, and it exploded. Crystals scattered across the white linen like broken ice. Dark wine spread outward in a slow, bleeding stain. The bodyguards by the door moved instantly, hands disappearing inside their jackets. Jihoon went rigid, his face pale, humiliated, and unable to respond in the same tongue. I was already reaching forward with a cloth napkin, gathering the largest shards carefully, my hands moving on their own. And before I could stop myself, before the cautious, invisible part of my brain could clamp down over my mouth, the words came out of me. I spoke in the old dialect, low and steady, the way my grandmother always spoke when she was correcting someone too proud to admit they were wrong. The glass did not fail. The hand forgot its own strength. The room stopped breathing. I placed the broken pieces carefully on the napkin. I did not look up. I did not move. I simply continued cleaning, as if I had said nothing at all. But the silence in that room was a completely different kind of silence now. Daesung did not move for a long time. When I finally looked up, because the silence had grown too heavy and too dangerous to continue ignoring, his eyes were fixed on my face with an expression I had never seen on a powerful man before. It was not anger. It was not contempt. It was pure, unguarded shock. "Where did you learn that language, girl?" he asked, still in the old dialect, testing me. I set down the cloth napkin slowly. I kept my voice respectful but steady. My grandmother taught me that dropping your eyes during a challenge was the same as handing someone your throat. "From my grandmother, Harabeoji," I said, using the respectful form of address my grandmother had drilled into me for years. She was born in a mountain village in Gangwon province. She married an African missionary doctor and raised me in both worlds. I learned the old language before I learned anything else. The bodyguards had not relaxed. Jihoon was staring at me with wide eyes, like a man watching someone survive a fall that should have been fatal. Daesung leaned forward on his cane. "What village?" I told him. Something shifted behind his eyes, deep and slow, like a door opening in a room that had been locked for decades. He sat back and looked at me for another long moment. Then he turned his head toward his son and said one sentence in the old dialect that I felt more than heard. "This one understands the weight of old things." Jihoon kept the restaurant closed the following morning. He sent all the staff home except me. He was sitting alone at the table by the window when I arrived. No jacket, shirt sleeves folded up to his forearms. He looked like someone who had not slept. He asked me to sit. I sat, because it was clear this was not a request. He asked me everything. Where I was born, how long I had been in Seoul, how exactly a woman with an African name ended up speaking an ancient Korean mountain dialect with the accent of someone who had been raised inside it. I told him the truth, the parts that mattered. My grandmother, Park Soo-yeon, was the daughter of a Highland family from Gangwon. She had left Korea at 23, met my grandfather at a medical mission in Ghana, and built a small community that was neither fully Korean nor fully African, but carried the bones of both cultures in everything it did. She raised me in that community after my parents died in a road accident when I was 6. She spoke the old dialect every day. She cooked with it, prayed with it, argued with it. She said modern Korean had become too soft, too full of borrowed foreign words. She wanted me to know the real language, the one with weight. Jihoon was quiet for a long time after I finished. My father's dialect is used only inside the oldest criminal families and a few mountain clans that never came into the modern era, he said slowly. Nobody outside those circles is supposed to understand it. He looked at me the way his father had looked at me, like I was something he could not categorize. Nobody told my grandmother that, I said. Daesung refused to begin any meetings without me present. Jihoon was furious. I could see it in the line of his shoulders, the way he spoke to his men in clipped sentences that morning. But he could not refuse his father, and everyone in the organization understood that. I was given a formal uniform, plain black, respectful. I was told to stand slightly behind Dae-sung, pour his tea at the correct temperature, and translate when he demanded it. What I was not told was how dangerous that position actually was. The meetings began the next afternoon. One by one, the heads of Seoul's rival syndicates were brought into the private room. Men who controlled port cargo, construction contracts, and neighborhoods where cash moved in envelopes rather than bank transfers. They arrived in expensive suits and left their weapons with the bodyguards outside. They came prepared to show respect to the old patriarch. Dae-sung would let them speak. He would sit quietly, hands folded over his cane, while they delivered their rehearsed words of loyalty and business promises. Then he would ask a single question, in the old dialect. Every single man faltered. Some smiled nervously and looked at Ji-hoon for help. Some attempted a few words of formal Old Korean and embarrassed themselves. Some simply went silent, realizing they had been tested and had failed before they understood the question. Then Dae-sung would turn to me. "Tell me what they are hiding, little one," he would say in the old tongue. I would watch each man's face carefully while I translated the question into standard Korean. A person's face during the gap between hearing something and understanding it tells you everything they have been trying to keep covered. On the third day, a captain named Park Tae-young walked in and immediately looked at me the wrong way. He was loud from the moment he entered, the kind of loud that is really a performance of confidence for the men watching behind him. He gave Dae-sung a respectful bow but dismissed it quickly. Then he turned to me with a thin smile that had no warmth in it at all. "Is this one your pet translator?" he said in casual Korean, gesturing at me like I was a piece of furniture that had been moved to an inconvenient location. The room got quiet. Dae-sung did not react. He simply watched. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I spoke in the old dialect, clearly and without rushing. I used a proverb my grandmother used whenever she encountered men who confused volume with power. "The frog in the shallow well thinks the sky is the size of the well's mouth." Several of the older guards lowered their eyes. One of Dae-sung's senior men, who had come from Korea with him, turned his face slightly away, which in that culture was the equivalent of covering a smile with both hands. Park Tae-young did not understand the words, but he understood the room's reaction perfectly. His face reddened slowly from the collar upward. Ji-hoon watched from his seat. He said nothing, but when I glanced at him briefly, there was something in his expression I had not seen there before. That evening, after the last meeting ended and the private room had been cleared, Dae-sung asked me to stay. Just the two of us, Ji-hoon remaining only because his father did not dismiss him. The old man poured his own tea this time, which surprised me. He set a second cup in front of me without being asked. I understood that this was significant and sat carefully. "What was your grandmother's family name?" he asked in the old dialect, his voice quieter now, the harshness stripped away to something more honest underneath. "Park," I said. "Park Soo-yeon." Dae-sung was silent. He turned the teacup in his hands slowly. "I knew a Park Soo-yeon," he said at last. "A long time ago, before I became what I am now, there was a massacre in the mountains. Political. The kind that governments do not record. I was 22 years old, and I was bleeding to death in a barn in winter." He paused. "A young woman from the village hid me for 4 days and got me to the road when it was safe. I could not breathe. She left Korea shortly after that," he said. "I never found her again." He looked at me, and for the first time since I had entered his orbit, the terrifying old patriarch looked like something close to a human being carrying an old, heavy grief. "Your grandmother saved my life," he said, "and she taught you the old language. I do not think that was an accident." After that night, everything became more complicated. Rumors had begun spreading through the organization that Dae-sung favored the African waitress above Ji-hoon's own captains, that she had access to closed meetings, that the old man listened to her. In a world built on hierarchy and the careful management of status, this was dangerous information. I started noticing small things. A conversation that went quiet when I entered a hallway. A look exchanged between two of Ji-hoon's men that lasted half a second too long. A message delivered through Mr. Baek that was worded just politely enough to be a threat if you understood how to read it. Someone left a folded piece of paper on my uniform jacket one morning. It said simply in Korean, "The route that spreads too wide gets cut." I did not tell Ji-hoon about the note. I kept it in my pocket and thought about it carefully. My grandmother had taught me that fear was useful information, not a command. You did not obey it. You listened to it, learned what it was pointing at, and planned accordingly. I began paying closer attention to the men in the room during meetings, not to the words they spoke to Dae-sung, but to the words they murmured to each other in the corridors. Fragments of the old dialect appeared sometimes, disguised inside casual conversations, phrases that sounded like pleasantries, but were not. I recognized the structure. My grandmother had called it speaking in stones, saying the true meaning one layer beneath the visible one. Someone was planning something. It happened on the 6th night. The meeting was supposed to be a final gathering of all the syndicate captains before Dae-sung returned to Korea. A formal gesture of unity for the old patriarch to carry home as proof that Ji-hoon's empire was stable and obedient. 15 men in the room, heavy food, expensive liquor, careful smiles. I stood behind Dae-sung with the tea service, as I had every night that week. But from the moment the room filled, something felt wrong in the way air feels wrong before a storm, a pressure that has no visible source. I listened. 2 men near the far end of the table were speaking to each other in low voices between toasts. Casual words about the food, about travel. But buried inside the rhythm of the old dialect, wrapped inside ordinary sentences the way something sharp can be wrapped inside cloth, I caught the meaning. After the old tiger leaves the room, the young one falls alone. My hands went cold on the tea tray. I scanned the room carefully. 3 men positioned near the exits. 1 captain with his jacket buttoned unusually high. A server who had not been part of Gianna's regular staff and who kept his back close to the wall. I had maybe 4 minutes before whatever was planned began moving. I leaned down and set the tea tray on the table directly in front of Dae-sung. Then I straightened and spoke in the old dialect, loudly enough for the entire room to hear, calmly enough that it sounded like a formal address rather than an alarm. The snake who enters the eagle's nest while the eagle watches has already chosen his ending. Every old family in these mountains knows this proverb. Every man in this room who still carries the old blood in him knows what comes next for the snake. The room went completely still. I looked directly at the 2 men who had been speaking in coded dialect. They had gone rigid. They understood that I had heard them. There are men in this room, I continued in the old tongue, not looking away, who are planning to dishonor the blood debt owed to this family tonight. They believe the old traditions no longer have teeth. They are wrong. Dae-sung had not moved, but his eyes had found the same 2 men mine were resting on. Ji-hoon stood up slowly. What followed was not violent. It did not need to be. The men who had been positioned near the exits found themselves suddenly surrounded by Ji-hoon's loyal captains. The unfamiliar server was removed quietly. The 2 men at the far end of the table were escorted out before they reached for anything. The room exhaled. Dae-sung picked up his teacup and drank from it slowly, as if nothing had occurred. Ji-hoon found me afterward in the kitchen corridor, where I had gone because my legs had stopped working properly, and I needed a wall to lean against. He stood in front of me for a moment without speaking. The controlled expression he wore in every meeting, every room, every interaction I had ever witnessed was completely gone. He looked exhausted and raw, and like someone who had just understood something important too. Late. You heard them in the dialect, he said. Yes. And you stopped it without firing a single shot. Words were enough. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look briefly like a man rather than the head of an organization. Every person who has ever stood near me wanted something, he said quietly. Money, protection, status, a connection to my name. He looked at me. You have never wanted any of those things. You stepped into the most dangerous room in Seoul, and your only instinct was to protect people using the language your grandmother taught you in a village in Ghana. I did not know what to say to that. "You are the most unusual person I have ever encountered, Amina," he said. It did not sound like a compliment exactly. It sounded like the truth spoken by someone unused to saying it plainly. "I just listened," I told him. "My grandmother said that most disasters announce themselves if you are quiet enough to hear them." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, like something inside him had just settled into place. The morning before Daesung's cars arrived to take him to the airport, he called me to the private room alone. Jihoon was not present for this meeting. Only Daesung, one senior aide, and me. The old man was already seated when I entered. He looked smaller in the morning light, older, more tired. He had removed his suit jacket and sat in a plain dark shirt. He looked like what he was beneath everything else, an old man carrying decades of choices he could not set down. "Sit," he said in the old dialect. I sat. He told me what I had already halfway understood since the night he described the barn in winter and the woman who had hidden him. He told me he had spent 40 years believing that the debt he owed Park Soo-yeon could never be repaid because he had never found her. He told me that when I had spoken the old words while cleaning the broken glass, he had felt something shift inside his chest that he could not name. Then he stood up, slowly. He placed both hands over his heart and bowed to me. A low, deliberate bow, the kind reserved in old Korean tradition for elders, for teachers, for those whose courage had earned a permanent debt of honor. His aide's head dropped forward in the same bow without hesitation. "Your grandmother gave me my life," Daesung said. "You gave my son his empire back. The debt has been repaid twice. Your grandmother was a great woman, Amina. So are you." I pressed my hands over my heart and bowed in return, the way she had taught me. Neither of us said anything after that. There was nothing left that words needed to carry. Jihoon was standing near the front entrance when I came out of the private room. The black vehicles were already waiting outside. Daesung moved past us with his aide and his bodyguards, pausing only to press his hand briefly against Jihoon's shoulder before walking through the doors into the gray Seoul morning. Jihoon watched him go. Then he turned to face me. He reached into his jacket and held out a small envelope. "Mr. Baek is leaving at the end of the month," he said. "I need someone who understands both the old world and this one. Someone who hears what rooms are actually saying instead of what people want them to hear." I looked at the envelope. I thought about my grandmother in her small kitchen in Ghana, teaching me mountain proverbs while the rain came down outside. I thought about the 6-year-old girl who had arrived in Seoul with a single bag and a language nobody here expected her to speak. I thought about 3 years of making myself so small and quiet that I nearly forgot I existed. I took the envelope. "I want to be clear about one thing," I said. Jihoon raised an eyebrow. "The wine selection in this restaurant is an embarrassment. Your father told me so in the old dialect on the second night. I was too afraid to say it then." Jihoon stared at me for 1 full second. Then he laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, filling the empty restaurant with a sound that had probably not lived inside these walls in years. "Fix it," he said. "I intend to," I told him. I slipped the envelope into my pocket, straightened my jacket, and walked forward into the life I had been quietly built for all along.